Welcome to the talk on packing even-directed circuits coordinate integrally. This is joint work with Kenichi Karabayashi, Stefan Kreutzer, and Sebastian Wiederrecht. I'm Maximilian Gorski, and the goal of this talk is basically to give you a surface-level overview of what we did and kind of motivate why we did it and what kind of algorithmic consequences one can expect or we got from these results. So before I get into our result, I'm going to give you a short history lesson on a result by Erdős and Pozsa from 685. And that result says there exists some function f such that for any k in all graphs G, either you can find k disjoint copies of cycles in G, or there exists a set A of vertices such that if you delete A, the graph is acyclic, and the set A is small in terms of k, and the smallness is determined by f. So basically, another way to phrase it is to say either you have a lot of cycles, or you're very close to being a forest, where close means you can delete a few vertices and then you're a forest. This kind of result became sort of popular, and there's a lot of results that look like this, and that's why there's a specific property that kind of expresses that you have this, that a certain type of graph has this property. I'm going to introduce this now, because that's what our main theorem is about. We say that a class of graphs C has the 1 over C Erdős-Pozsa property if there exists a function f, such that for any k in all digraphs or normal graphs G, either there exists k copies of graphs from C in G, such that no vertex appears in C plus one of these copies, or there exists an A, such that A is again small, and G minus A contains no copy of something from C. So the distinction here between their nice result is that we're kind of allowing for some less neat non-disjoint copies, but they can't overlap too much. For example, if I chose C to be 2, then there couldn't be 3 copies that share the same vertex, any vertex. That's where this fractional part comes in. But again, the idea is either you have a lot of something and it's fairly well separated, a lot of fairly well separated copies of something, or it's fairly easy to actually delete everything that resembles the thing we're searching for from the graph. And just because I'm going to need this later, so for fixed values of small c, we call this the integral Erdős-Pozsa property if it's 1 over 1, so the things have to be disjoint. Or if c is 2, we call it half integral, so 2 things can share something, but no 3 things can share the same vertex. And for c equals 3, a third, and for c equals 4, it's quarter integral. So let me again give you a sort of different perspective on what this means, why it could be interesting to look at these and what this kind of result could express. So for the Erdős-Pozsa result, I said we're expressing closeness to a forest, which is a fairly simple class. What if we did something like in the title, what if you did something like forbidding even cycles or odd cycles? So for no cycles, we get forests. For no odd cycles, we get bipartite graphs. So we're kind of measuring distance to a simple class. And for even cycles, this is probably not known to most of the audience that there's should express something, but actually there's something called the theta properties for even cycles, where if you have some cycle and it's not even, so it's odd, then if there is some path that connects 2 points on this cycle, then no matter what the length of this path is, you're going to get an even cycle in this constellation of this cycle with a path, which looks like a theta. That's why it's a theta property. And that ultimately means that if you have a graph without even cycles, then the only cycles you can have are odd, and those can't have any paths that look like this. So really, we're looking at very, very simple graphs. If this is something to you, you kind of have a block decomposition into odd cycles and bridges. So it's not very much happening here. And that's why these are, again, simple. But what about digraphs? So what about directed graphs? What if you have no directed cycles? Then we're in the class of directed acyclic graphs, also known as DAGs, which are simpler than digraphs, certainly, simpler than normal directed graphs, but they're not quite forest-like. For no odd directed cycles, we get bipartite directed graphs. So the underlying graph is again bipartite, but it's not entirely simple, but it's simpler than a normal directed graph. But maybe we should think about our main result. What does it mean to have no even directed cycles? And here again, we might ask, okay, is there some sort of tether property? And it turns out that no, this is not true. You can have an odd cycle and a path that is also odd, and that can somehow interact in a way that you do not get an even cycle in this. So this is kind of a dangerous thing, but maybe there's some other way to characterize this. And in fact, this was a big open question posed at the beginning of the 70s by several people. What are these graphs? Like, can you characterize graphs without even directed cycles in some sensible way? And pretty quickly, actually, we got non-algorithmic answers. I'll tell you in a moment why algorithmic is important. By Little in 75 and Seymour and Thomason in 85, they were kind of working in different settings, not necessarily directly focusing on graphs without even directed cycles initially. And because this is an algorithmically relevant question, the algorithmic answers turned out to be much harder to get. We got them around like the turn of the last century. And the reason why these are interesting things, and the reason why this is an interesting class, is because these graphs are simple in the sense that we can solve some problems on them. And these problems happen to be not just in graph theory, but outside of graph theory. So for example, the graphs we're defining here, the directed graphs, correspond to matrices on which computing the permanent is easily possible. You can also see these graphs as corresponding to undirected graphs, where counting the number of perfect matchings, which is also a difficult problem, is also feasible. And you can also solve the Ising model here, which is relevant for physicists, or estimate molecular stability, which is, I guess, relevant for chemists. So all of this weird class, again, we don't really talk much about these kinds of graphs, but this weird class has some really nice properties and has some nice applications. So we're kind of having, by proving that even directed cycles have this property, we kind of have some theorem that says that either you have a lot of these cycles, or you're very close to being in a very nice class of graphs where things are relatively easy, even if it's not easy to identify them initially. Now we have a description, so we can see them as easy. So let me give you a short overview of the Erdős-Póger results we have for these graphs, starting with the undirected ones. I already gave you the original Erdős-Póger result. For cycles, these have integral Erdős-Póger. For even cycles, because of the tether property, it's actually extremely easy to show that they have the integral Erdős-Póger property, so I'm not going to discuss this much. And for odd cycles, we see something that justifies why we have these weird fractions, because for odd cycles, you don't have the integral Erdős-Póger property. And the small graph I drew on the bottom is the reason why this is not true. So look at the white part at the grid. This guy is bipartite. So because it's bipartite, we know it has no odd directed cycles. And then I took 4 edges and I kind of twisted them, connected them at the top, twisted them, and then connected it at the bottom. So these edges you can actually use to get an odd cycle in this graph. So you could run through the grid from one endpoint of the green edge to the other, and you will see that this will produce an odd cycle. But if you want another odd cycle, you have to again run through the grid. But because of the way I twisted the edges, you will have to intersect the first odd cycle I drew. So you can blow this up into larger grids with more stuff going from the top to the bottom. And you will notice that you can only get a single odd cycle if you want disjoint stuff. So you know that it's impossible to actually separate this grid easily, but it's not possible to get large integral packings. That's why we know that they don't have the integral Erdős-Póger property. But they do have the half integral Erdős-Póger property, as proven by Reed, again, the turn of the last century. For directed stuff, everything gets much, much harder. We know that dicycles, so directed cycles, have the integral Erdős-Póger property, and this was conjectured actually, or asked about by Younger in the early 70s, but it took a lot of time to actually get there and prove that this was true. For odd dicycles, we only found this out very recently. Last year, a paper appeared Soda that proved that they have the half-integral Erdős-Póger property, and I'll get into the integral part in a bit. And we here present our work on the quarter-integral Erdős-Póger property of even dicycles, but we've also recently been able to get this further down to the third integral. And for half-integral, we're still kind of in the dark. This seems to require some new techniques at least. So why do even dicycles not have the integral Erdős-Póger property? Here I can actually present you a counterexample that itself is very planar, even more than planar, strongly planar, if that means something to you. But that means that somehow this not having this property seems to be very fundamental to these guys. So the counterexample you can see here kind of consists of a cylindrical grid. These are concentric cycles with paths going in and out from these cycles. And if you ignore the orange vertices, you have what we call the cylindrical grid. And here in the middle, I subdivided one of the edges with a blue vertex, which turns the entire grid into an odd digraph. So there's no even cycles in there. And if I put the orange vertices back, you can actually correct the parity of these cycles to get even cycles. But just as with the Escher wall, the wall that I presented at the bottom, the undirected thing, you can't get two disjoint even directed cycles. That shows that, again, these don't have the integral exposure property. And in this case, you even have a counterexample that is planar, which is quite striking. Okay, so let me briefly explain how we end up proving this. We end up proving this via structure theory. So the reason why our paper is so long is because we have to prove basically a facsimile, or not a facsimile, something analogous to a graph-minor structure theorem. And to tell you what that means, let me briefly present Robertson-Seymour's graph-minor structure theorem. And it basically says, I'm going to be very rough here, either a graph contains a subgraph that behaves like a large clique, so some kt, so a clique with t vertices, or it has a tree-like structural decomposition into parts that look like this, where this is this picture, and I'm concentrated on the part that is kind of surrounded by the blue line. And the apices, the orange stuff, is stuff we get to delete. And the rest is an embedding of a graph in a surface that is almost like a planar embedding, almost. And the almost part is some easily separable, some part that is easily separable, and some non-planar part. These are called vortices. This is in green, but the vortices somehow are not well connected into the rest of the graph. And all of these, the number of apices we get to delete, the number of non-planar parts, vortices that we have, and also the genus of the surface in which we're embedding this graph, these are all bounded by the size of the clique we're searching for. This sounds extremely esoteric. The reason why this is interesting, or why you should be interested, I think, is because this has significant algorithmic consequences. And we've seen this ever since the graph-minor structure theorem was proven, and even before with the development of the parameter tree width. You can do significant, very interesting things with these, even if the structure theorem itself seems kind of weird. So some things you can do is solve the k-disjoint path problem with specified endpoints. So not just Menger, but actually saying, I want these things to be connected in this way. And this also enables you to test for this presence of certain minors, whatever that means. And there's many more specialized results that came out of this entire theory. And we have a similar structure theorem, which is actually one of the first structure theorems on digraphs, at least the first published one. And ours looks a little bit like this. This is actually slightly simpler than what Robertson and Seymour present, because the thing we're searching for is also more easy to find, let's say, than a clique minor. So our theorem says either a directed graph contains a quarter integral packing of t even directed cycles. So this is the thing that Erdős-Pozsár tries to find, this packing of even directed cycles, but they are allowed to overlap a little bit. Or I again have a tree-like structural decomposition into parts that look basically like this. The blue part is again a surface, but in this case, it has to be a sphere. There are no green parts, there are no vortices. There's again a few things you get to delete. This is in terms of the number of directed cycles you're searching for. And the embedding of the graph is very strongly planar. Again, there's like small areas of non-planarity, but again, they're easy to separate. So what do we get from this? So the first thing we get is, of course, to mention that this tree-like thing, because it works like a tree, allows us to do a dynamic programming argument to prove that even directed cycles have the Erdős-Pozsár property, or the quarter integral Erdős-Pozsár property, I should say. But another thing we get is algorithmic results. This is mostly FPT and XP stuff. We can also solve the k-disjoint directed paths problem in directed graphs with low directed tree width. So it's not as general as they did, but our result does generalize existing results. And we can also, via some tricks and translations, count perfect matchings in special classes of bipartite graphs. Finally, let me mention that this is one of the first structure theorems of this type in directed graphs. And to get there, we had to prove or develop several new techniques that kind of circumvented existing roadblocks in directed graph structure theory, because of course other people have tried to get there, or there have been other problems, other projects trying to get to a directed structure theorem, but this has been the first one that actually managed to get past all the hurdles that such an attempt presents. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope you got something from this.